too many things on the face. Glasses one place. There we go. Ground control to Major Tom. Shabbat Shalom. So I hope you were paying attention, or at least went back and reviewed after I told you to. What was the punishment? What was the fall? What happened to us when we ate from that forbidden fruit? Apparently our soul had died? I'm not quite sure where you saw that in the text. It does not say that. So indeed, there are many other religious traditions that try to turn our eating into a spiritual death, a spiritual rebirth, an eternal damnation, being condemned forever to have sin even at the moment of conception. Judaism says, you weren't reading the same book I was reading, because that is not what the Torah says. We just read it. It does not say anything about a spiritual death. The implication that somehow we would have lived forever if we had not eaten from that is nowhere implied, though some may indeed argue that way, but it is not anywhere explicitly said that we would have lived forever ever had we not eaten that fruit. We'll come back to say we might have been unaware of our mortality, but that is very different than believing we were immortal. They became aware of their condition. And what was their condition? What are the specifics that God says, this is what's going to happen? We're going to have to open up the book again? What happens? Okay, hold on. Let's make it very clear. We'll go in order. Set aside the snake for a moment. We don't really care about him. Right? What happens? What does God address to the woman, to Chava? Okay, you're going to have pain in childbirth and potentially also in pregnancy and child rearing, depending upon how you want to read that section of text. Does that mean that the female body was able to give birth without any pain, was able to carry without any discomfort, was able to raise a child without any sorrows prior to us eating from that fruit? That eating the fruit, or God somehow cursing us, in quotes, caused a physiological change in the woman's body? It's possible, but does the text actually say, from now on, your body's going to be different than it was before? No. So why is there pain now, and there wasn't pain before? And we do know, by the way, from the way the Hebrew describes, as was also read this morning, the conception of Cain and Abel, that Adam and Eve were already on familiar terms prior to leaving the garden, prior to the eating of the fruit. So the general consensus, at least among Jewish scholars, and indeed there are other scholars from different traditions which have its own polemic against this and against the Hebrew, at least according to Jewish scholars, sexuality, intimacy, conception, and birth were all things that were happening in the garden. These are not the antithesis of God's perfection. These are perfectly fine. So why would we now all of a sudden have pain in pregnancy and in birth and in child rearing? Awareness. Now we are not animals. Now we look at our children and we worry. Do you think a parakeet worries? Right? Oh no, where am I going to get enough seed to feed them? No, they do what they do. They do by instinct, they do by nature, and yes, they will have to struggle, but do they think of it as struggle? Do they feel the pain that happens? Yes, there are certain neurological things that happen on, but do they identify it as, this is suffering, while going through the process of putting an egg in the nest, or putting a live birth into the stable? No. They are not aware of it as suffering. They suffer. It hurts, absolutely. Anybody who's ever been there when an animal has given birth, will know that the animal is well aware that something unusual is going on. And as it sweats and pants and is clearly looking exhausted from the ordeal, you are absolutely able to imagine that this is an animal that is suffering, but you have in your conception that this is something to be called suffering. The animal just knows it's giving birth. It's just doing what it does. And indeed, says Rambam, that was our condition before we ate from the tree. Before we ate from the tree, we were like an animal. And that's not a negative thing, says Rambam. In fact, he argues that because we were made B'Tselem Elohim, we were the most exceptional of animals. We were so exceptionally made in God's image that we knew what was true and what was false at an instinctual level about everything in the world. If you were to go up to a pre-tree-eating Adam and say, what shape is the world? He wouldn't understand the question. He would just say, it's round. Of course it's a ball. It was built into him to know that. He could know of no alternative. He was aware of what was true because it was true. And he had nothing to confuse him, nothing to delude him, nothing to persuade him that the truth was anything but the truth and that falsehood was anything but falsehood. Much like an animal will recognize what is true and false within its own realm of instinctual awareness, so too humans had this pure understanding of the world and themselves and everything without an awareness of the emotional or moral layer on top of it. That was what was different. And so when we ate from the fruit, we went to work. Does that mean we were not working before? No. If you can go back and check my Wednesday class this week, you will see we were already working in the garden. God told us to work in the garden before we ate from the tree. So why is it now that our work is causing us suffering? Why is it now with our toil, our effort, and however you want to translate those different words, our suffering, we are earning our food? Were we not before? Were we doing no work? We just sat and the food magically fell into our mouth? We still sweated before, but now we are aware of our sweat and how much it stinks. Right now, because we are aware of good and evil, we can look at what's going on and say, this ain't fun. This is not good. Right? Does that parakeet complain when it goes out to get the seed? No, it gets the seed. And if it's hard, it's hard. If it's easy, it's easy. It doesn't judge the act of getting and doing what it needs to do. But now when a person is sitting at a job they hate, they can say, I hate this. And they can be unhappier than an animal that had been sat down at that same desk and was forced to do the same job, because the animal would not understand that this was bad. The animal would simply be either discomfort or no discomfort, but it would not have that moral judgment, that layer upon it of whether it is good and bad at a higher level of understanding. This is the curse that we were given when we ate from the fruit. It didn't change the human activity, but it changed the human emotional response to our activity. And, says Rambam, it also changed our ability to tell true from false. Because you see, once you have knowledge of good and evil, once you know that there are right and wrong things in the world, once you know there is a good and a bad, then your mind begins to use that as a lens to interpret the world around you. And sometimes your analysis of good and bad is wrong. And sometimes it is at variance with what is true and false. And now you begin to convince yourself that what is false is actually true and what is true is actually false because you want it to. Because you have chosen to do something that is wrong, you can now delude yourself into thinking that it is right. This is a new stage in human development, and this, indeed, is probably the biggest curse that we have to bear throughout the rest of the Tanakh, is that we have suddenly had our eyes opened to be able to decide for ourselves whether something is right and wrong, and to choose stupidly and use our amazing mental capacity to tell ourselves we're so smart. Because once we begin To do that, it becomes much harder for us to correct course. Go back again to our parakeet. Our parakeet keeps pecking at something it thinks is seed, but isn't actually seed. It's gravel or plastic or something else. Eventually, the parakeet's going to realize this ain't seed and move on. Because the parakeet knows what's real, knows what's not, at least after it tests it a little bit. But a human will continue to do the same stupid thing over and over again, regardless of the facts that are staring it in the face, because it has convinced itself that this is good, regardless of the damage it is doing to itself. Think about people who suffer from addiction. They have convinced themselves, both because of the physiological response as well as the emotional and psychological, that what they are doing is necessary. It must be done. Whereas if we were to step outside of our humanity for a while, we'd look at that and say, this makes no sense. This makes no sense. And any objective, right-thinking person would tell you it made no sense, but when we are inside the human condition, it is not easy to see that. Example number 2. When was the last time an animal out in the wilderness decided to go on a diet because it had been eating the wrong stuff too much? We're laughing, right? Or maybe you have a pet, and maybe you've had to put your pet on a special diet. I'll tell you this, it's not because your pet did something wrong. It's because its owner did something wrong. Because the owner was not making good choices. The pet was simply doing what its environment told it to do. But if that pet was living out in the wild, and assuming it was able to survive on its own without human interference, you don't see animals just chowing down on candy bars to the neglect of everything else. They eat what is naturally good for them. They do not convince themselves that they should eat something which is not good for them to their own detriment and harm to their own health. But we do all the time. We do make choices all the time that are bad for ourselves. But we convince ourselves that they are right. This is the true curse that we have from eating that fruit. And this is not the curse that God somehow damned us with. This is simply the inevitable consequence of being aware that there is a right and a wrong in the world. Once you are able to understand that there is good and bad in the world, and you do not have a secret decoder ring built into your soul that tells you constantly which is and which isn't good and bad, then you are prone to confusing yourself about how you should behave. Which means, of course, if we don't have a built-in decoder ring, we need an external decoder ring. We need some way to unravel this mess of what is right and what is wrong to be able to overcome our own propensity for self-delusion and deception. And of course, that decoder ring is the Torah, what's sitting behind me in the ark, and what we just read from. Right? The Torah, and how it is expressed through Judaism and through Jewish law, is designed to help us move past our ability to confuse and delude ourselves, to convince ourselves that what is wrong is actually right because we want it. We see a hint of that, by the way, of at least the potential when Chava is deciding to eat the fruit, because, it actually looks like it might be good, it might taste good. She begins to convince herself to do. The Torah is there to say, stop it. Yes, you can convince yourself if you want, but if you at least are willing to listen to halakha and to Torah, to Jewish law, and what God has given us, then you will be nudged back into a better path than if left to your own devices. This is our fall, but this is also our potential to rise. Because that state that we were in before we ate from the fruit, that was the state of, perhaps you might call it naive animal instinct. And it may be tempting to wish we could go back to that. But the problem is, if you were there, you wouldn't know you were. That is to say, if you were in a state of naive unawareness of yourself and the world such that you could operate on this pure, correct path of what is right and what is wrong without having any questions of what is good and what is bad, you wouldn't be aware that you were actually doing anything. You would simply be going through life on instinct, on autopilot. And that might be a little bit more comfortable. But as I already mentioned, it would only be comfortable because you would be changing your moral judgments about what was happening. It wouldn't actually change what was happening. Giving birth would still be painful. You just wouldn't have a judgment about it that made it feel like suffering. Working would still be hard. You just wouldn't have a judgment about it that made you feel bad that it was hard. But with the ability to see what is good and what is bad, and with the ability to use our minds to understand the gift of Torah, to understand the gift of Jewish law, and to use all the reason at our disposal to claw back good understanding of what is true and what is false and overcome our own self-deception, we can end up much greater than we were before we ate that fruit. Because we now have the power to rise higher and know that we are doing it. But it all depends on you. It all depends on you choosing to do that. Because if you choose to live on autopilot now, you are much worse off than that animal was before it ate that fruit of the tree. If you live on autopilot now, you will know that you are suffering, and you will continue to suffer. And that is much worse than being an ignorant animal. But choose wisely. Use the gifts God has given you. And heaven is at your footsteps. Be well, and Shabbat Shalom.